October 1957. Just after midnight. West 126th Street, Harlem. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped out of the black Buick and didn't take another step. 6 men were already there. They weren't yelling. They weren't running. They were spaced out across the sidewalk and the mouth of the alley like they'd rehearsed it. 2 by the fire escape. 1 leaning against a parked delivery truck. 3 more fanned across the curb. Every single one of them had a gun, and none of them were shaking. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution that had been planned down to the minute. One of the men spoke first. His voice was calm, almost polite. "Evening, Bumpy." Johnson looked at the speaker, then at the others. He counted them again, slower this time. 6. No obvious exit, no backup behind him. The driver was still in the car, hands frozen on the wheel. Bumpy didn't reach for his coat. He didn't step back. He didn't run. He stood there, hands open at his sides, and said, "If you're going to do it clean." That was the moment everyone later argued about, because these men hadn't come here to talk. They had come because someone wanted Bumpy Johnson dead before sunrise, and they'd been paid well to make sure he didn't leave that sidewalk alive. The reason was simple. Earlier that week, a shipment of heroin meant for an Italian crew never made it downtown. Someone had tipped off the cops. 2 men got arrested. 1 overdosed in the precinct holding cell before dawn. And the word on the street was that Bumpy Johnson had signed off on it. Whether that was true didn't matter anymore. Someone believed it. And belief was enough to pull triggers. The man by the truck raised his pistol slightly, not aiming yet, just enough to make the point. Another shifted his weight, blocking the alley completely. The fire escape creaked as one of them adjusted his stance above. This was tight, professional. No witnesses nearby, no windows lit. One of the gunmen took a step forward, younger than the rest. Nervous eyes. Sweat on his upper lip despite the cold. "Mr. Johnson," he said, forcing respect into his voice, "we don't want trouble. Just don't make this hard." Bumpy looked at him then. Really looked. Saw the tremor in his hand. The way his finger brushed the trigger guard instead of resting cleanly on it. And for the first time, Bumpy smiled. Not wide, not friendly, knowing. "You boys picked the wrong night," he said. The men didn't laugh, because something wasn't lining up. Bumpy Johnson was surrounded, no gun drawn, no leverage visible, no one backing him up. And yet he wasn't bargaining, he wasn't pleading, he wasn't even stalling, he was waiting. The youngest gunman glanced to his left, just for half a second as if checking for a cue that hadn't come yet. That was when the driver in the Buick finally spoke, his voice barely audible through the open door. "Boss, you want me to—" "Stay," Bumpy said without turning around. Then he raised his eyes past the gunman toward the dark end of the block, and the men surrounding him realized, almost too late, that this hit might not be happening the way they had been promised. Because if Bumpy Johnson wasn't afraid, what did he know that they didn't? The youngest gunman's name was Calvin Porter, and he should not have been there that night. Calvin was 26. Harlem born. Not a killer by trade, just a driver who'd taken too many wrong turns and run out of time to fix them. 3 months earlier, his wife Lena had collapsed on the kitchen floor while boiling water for coffee. No warning, no scream, just the sound of the pot hitting the linoleum and her head cracking against the cabinet door. The doctor used careful words. Brain aneurysm. Surgery possible, but expensive, immediate, No payment plan. Calvin made $14 a day driving packages for a garment wholesaler. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. That was when Vincent "Vinny" Caruso found him. Caruso didn't threaten him, didn't raise his voice. He just sat across from Calvin at a diner on Lenox Avenue, slid a folded piece of paper across the table and said, "You do this one job, your wife gets the best surgeon in the city." Inside the paper was an address, a time, and a number written in red ink. Ellsworth Johnson. Calvin knew the name. Everyone did. But Caruso waved it off like it was nothing. "You won't have to pull the trigger," Caruso said. "Just be there. We need numbers, presents, that's it." Calvin said yes before he finished his coffee. Now he stood on West 126th Street with a gun that felt heavier than it should, watching Bumpy Johnson smile like a man who already knew the ending. Calvin's stomach twisted, because this wasn't how Caruso described it. Caruso said Johnson would panic, try to talk, maybe run. The job would be loud and fast, over in seconds. But Bumpy wasn't doing any of that. He was calm, too calm. Calvin shifted his feet and glanced toward Raymond Stax Mullins, the man leading the crew. Stax was older, scar across his cheek, calm eyes. The kind of man who didn't ask questions after midnight. Stax didn't look back. Instead he said, "Johnson, last chance." Bumpy tilted his head slightly. "You don't sound sure." That landed harder than any insult. Stax tightened his jaw. "You think you're smarter than 6 guns?" "No," Bumpy said. "I think you're standing where you shouldn't be." Calvin swallowed. He hadn't noticed before, but the street was quiet in a way that felt wrong. No passing cars, no distant music. Even the wind seemed to have backed off. Calvin thought of Lena, pale under hospital lights, her hand squeezing his weakly when he promised he'd take care of it. He told himself this was survival, not loyalty, not greed, survival. Then Bumpy's eyes met his, just for a second. And Calvin felt seen, not judged, not threatened, measured, as if Bumpy was deciding whether Calvin would live through the next 5 minutes. From behind them, somewhere farther down the block, a bottle shattered. Everyone flinched. Stax half-turned, gun rising. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no voices, just silence again. Stax cursed under his breath. "That wasn't part of the plan," someone muttered. Calvin's pulse spiked. Because Caruso had been very clear. No surprises, no witnesses, no complications. And yet here they were, stalled, exposed, with a man who looked like he'd already won a fight that hadn't started. Calvin leaned toward Stax and whispered, "You sure this is clean?" Stax didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was lower, tighter. "Doesn't matter anymore." Calvin's grip tightened on the gun. If this went wrong, Lena wouldn't get surgery. If it went right, Calvin would have to live with what he'd done. And standing in the middle of that choice was a man who refused to move. So the question wasn't whether someone was about to die. It was whether Calvin Porter would be able to pull the trigger when the moment came, or if someone else had already decided his fate. Stax gave a subtle nod. 2 of the men shifted closer, tightening the circle. The space around Bumpy shrank until the night itself felt pressed in. Bumpy didn't flinch. "Before you do this," he said, voice steady, "you should ask who sent you." Stax let out a short breath through his nose. "We know who sent us." "No," Bumpy replied. "You know who paid you." That landed differently. The man by the fire escape glanced down. Another gunman adjusted his stance. suddenly uncertain. Even Stax hesitated just a fraction of a second too long. Calvin felt it in his chest, the moment when confidence leaks out of a room. Stax recovered fast. "You trying to buy time?" "I don't need time," Bumpy said. "I need you to listen." Stax raised his gun higher. "You had your chance." Bumpy nodded once, as if accepting that. Then he said a name. "Vincent Caruso." Calvin's breath caught. No one had mentioned Caruso out loud. Not in the diner. Not on the walk over. Not in the car. He was supposed to stay invisible. Stax's eyes flicked involuntarily toward Calvin. Just for a heartbeat. That was enough. Bumpy watched the exchange and smiled again, thinner this time. "You didn't know," he said. "Did you?" Stax snapped back, "Shut up." But it was too late. The other men were watching now. Measuring Stax the way predators measure weakness. Bumpy continued, his tone almost conversational. "Caruso's got a brother, you know that?" No one answered. "He did," Bumpy corrected. "Past tense. Name was Anthony. Took a bullet in Queens last spring. Bad information, wrong alley." Calvin's pulse hammered. Bumpy's eyes stayed locked on Stax. "Anthony didn't die right away. He lived long enough to talk." Stax's face hardened. "You're lying." "I wish I was," Bumpy said. "He told me who set him up. Told me who was skimming shipments and blaming it on me. Told me who needed me gone before I could answer back." The man near the truck shifted. "Stax?" Stax didn't look at him. "He's trying to split us." "Am I?" Bumpy asked. "Because if I was lying, Caruso wouldn't have rushed this." Calvin's thoughts raced. Caruso had been insistent. Tonight, no delays, no backups, get it done fast. At the time, Calvin thought that meant confidence. Now it felt like fear. Bumpy took a slow step forward. 3 guns snapped up instantly, fingers tightened. "Easy," Bumpy said. "You shoot me, you prove him right." Stax barked, "Don't listen to him." But his voice cracked on the last word. Bumpy turned his attention back to Calvin. "You've got a wife in the hospital," he said calmly. Calvin froze. "How?" His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I know things," Bumpy said. "I know Caruso paid the surgeon already, made sure you wouldn't ask questions." Calvin's head spun. That's not true." Bumpy didn't blink. "Check your pocket." Calvin hesitated, then slowly slid his free hand into his coat. There was an envelope. He hadn't felt it before. He was sure of it. Inside was a receipt, paid in full, dated yesterday. The world tilted. Stax stared at Calvin now. "What is that?" Calvin couldn't speak. Bumpy said it for him. "It's insurance. Caruso doesn't need witnesses after tonight." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. One of the men swore softly. Another took a step back, recalculating. Stax's jaw clenched. "You're trying to turn them." "I don't have to," Bumpy replied. "You already did." A car engine hummed somewhere at the far end of the block. Slow, unhurried, not a patrol car, something else. Stax heard it too. His eyes darted toward the sound, then back to Bumpy. "You set this up," he said. Bumpy shrugged. "I prepared." The engine grew louder, tires crunching over debris. Calvin felt his choice collapsing. If he stayed, he was disposable. If he ran, he'd be hunted. If he turned his gun. The car's headlights swung into the street, washing over them all. And that's when Stax realized the worst part. This wasn't a standoff anymore. It was a countdown. And someone was about to make the first irreversible move. The headlights cut through the fog like a blade. A black Cadillac eased into the street, engine humming low but deliberate. The gunman tensed, hands tightening on steel. Calvin felt his knuckles whitening around the pistol he wasn't sure he could fire. Bumpy didn't flinch. He tilted his head, watching, calculating. Stax barked an order. "Go! End it now!" The circle tightened. Calvin felt the heat from the men around him, each trying to anticipate the other's move. Then, before anyone could raise a finger, Bumpy Johnson moved. Not forward, not back. He stepped sideways. A small, subtle shift, but it changed everything. From inside the Cadillac, a man stepped out. Not Caruso, not one of the expected backup shooters. Anthony Caruso, alive. Calvin froze. His mind couldn't process it. Anthony, Caruso's brother, the one who'd supposedly been killed in Queens, was standing there alive, a pistol in hand. Bumpy nodded toward him. "Meet the man who started this entire thing." Stax's face went pale. The man he thought dead was alive, holding a gun, and now watching him. He stammered, I don't understand." Anthony smiled, a cold, practiced smile. "You should have verified your intel, Stax." The revelation hit everyone like a punch. Caruso had lied. The whole hit, the timing, the setup, it was orchestrated under false pretenses. Anthony had survived the Queen's ambush, had gone into hiding, and now he was back to finish what had been started. Calvin's chest tightened. Lena, the envelope, the surgery, everything. He'd been used as a pawn, a distraction to get the real players into position. Stax's hands shook as he raised his gun toward Anthony. Don't, Bumpy interrupted. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the tense street. "You pull that trigger, Anthony does too, and then everyone here dies?" Anthony laughed softly. "Smart, very smart, Bumpy." He nodded at Johnson. "I underestimated you." Then Bumpy turned back to the crew surrounding him. "And now you all have a choice," he said. "Do you shoot me or do you shoot your own?" For a split second, everything froze. Calvin looked from Stax to Anthony to Bumpy. The line between predator and prey had dissolved. Stax made a snap decision. He fired. The gun clicked empty. Misfire. Bumpy's hand moved in a blur. In one motion, he disarmed Stax, yanking the gun away and twisting it until it was useless. The other men hesitated, unsure where to aim. Anthony's finger was steady on his trigger, but Bumpy's calm defiance forced him to pause. Calvin felt a strange mix of relief and horror. Relief that he hadn't had to pull the trigger. Horror because now he realized the stakes had changed entirely. No longer was survival simply following orders. Now survival meant choosing sides against the truth. Bumpy nodded toward Calvin. "Your move," he said. "Do you stay or do you leave?" Calvin's mind raced. Lena, her life, his own, the gun, the envelope. Stax cursed, realizing the setup had turned against him completely. He was the pawn now. Anthony lowered his gun slightly, nodding. "I don't care about him. I care about that man who knows everything." His gaze locked on Bumpy again. Then Bumpy made a decision. He stepped slightly toward Anthony, tilting his head, daring him. Anthony hesitated. And in that heartbeat, Calvin understood, the real twist. Wasn't Anthony's survival. It wasn't the misfire. It wasn't even the setup. It was Bumpy Johnson had already decided who would live and who would die, and everyone else was just catching up. A single gunshot rang out from the Cadillac. It wasn't from Anthony. It wasn't from Stax. It hit one of the men behind Stax square in the chest. He collapsed silently to the pavement. Chaos erupted. Shouts, scrambling feet, guns raised, a second shot. Bumpy didn't move. Calvin didn't move. Stax panicked. Anthony froze, and the street itself seemed to hold its breath. Bumpy's calm smile returned. "Now," he said, "who's left to decide?" The answer would change everything, but no one could see it coming. Because the true betrayal was not who survived this night. It was who sent them there in the first place. And that person was still in the shadows. The street, tense and silent just moments ago, was now a battlefield of shifting loyalties and shattered certainty. Calvin looked down at the envelope in his hand. Paid in full, guaranteed survival. But at what cost? And in the distance, a siren wailed, coming closer. So who would make the next move? Who would live? And who would die before the night ended? The clock was running, and the real storm hadn't even hit yet. The gun smoke hadn't even cleared when the first reality hit. Stax Mullins, the man who had thought himself untouchable, lay on the pavement, blood spreading across his jacket. He wasn't dead yet, but Bumpy didn't bother checking. Survival wasn't about saving everyone, it was about choosing the right ones. Calvin Porter stumbled back, heart hammering. Lena, the envelope, her life. The choices that had seemed so simple just minutes ago were now tangled in blood and betrayal. Anthony Caruso backed toward the Cadillac, eyes still locked on Bumpy. His smirk had vanished, replaced with the cold calculation of a man who realized he was outmaneuvered. You tricked me," he hissed. Bumpy didn't answer. He stepped over the body of Stack's lieutenant, a silent signal to the remaining men. Two of them dropped their weapons immediately, surrendering to the realization that they were outclassed, outsmarted and outnumbered by circumstance. They hadn't understood. Calvin's hands shook as he stared at the envelope. The surgeon's payment. The life of the woman he loved. It was supposed to be a simple transaction, a clean exchange. Now it felt like a ledger written in blood. Bumpy turned slowly toward him. "Keep it," he said. "Your life is already owed to someone else." Calvin blinked. What do you mean?" "Caruso," Bumpy replied. "He paid for more than your wife. He paid for you to survive, but not for you to be clean." He let the word hang. "You'll carry this night with you. The choice, the fear, the hesitation, all of it. That's your cost." Calvin dropped the envelope into his coat pocket and nodded. He couldn't argue. He couldn't move yet. Anthony, realizing there was nothing left to salvage, climbed back into the Cadillac. His eyes lingered on Bumpy. "This isn't over," he said. Bumpy only nodded. "It is for tonight." The Cadillac pulled away, its engine fading into the night. Silence fell over the block again, broken only by the shallow breathing of the remaining men and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Calvin sank to the curb, adrenaline leaving him in waves that made his legs weak. He had survived, yes, but survival wasn't victory. The cost of inaction, the cost of the envelope in his pocket, the lives lost around him, it all pressed down like a weight he couldn't lift. Stack's surviving men helped him to his feet, their loyalty fractured, their fear evident. One of them muttered barely above a whisper, "He played us all." Calvin didn't answer. He couldn't. His thoughts were with Lena, with the choice he'd almost made, with the reality that his life and hers had been bought and paid for by someone who thrived on manipulation. Bumpy Johnson turned and walked down the street, slow, deliberate, untouched by the chaos he had orchestrated. Calvin watched him go, a mixture of awe and terror settling in his chest. Tonight, Bumpy had won. The gunman had lost. Anthony Caruso had failed. Calvin had survived. But the victory was hollow. Everyone carried a debt they couldn't measure. And Calvin realized that some consequences wouldn't be paid in dollars. As he straightened, he caught sight of Stax, alive but bleeding, glaring at him. Fear, betrayal, and fury all twisted into one look. Calvin knew Stax would remember tonight forever, and he'd probably never forgive him. The night air was heavy, filled with the stench of gunpowder and wet asphalt. Calvin tucked the envelope tighter against his chest. He had won his life, but not his peace. And in the distance, Harlem slept unaware of the night's brutal reckoning. By dawn, word of the standoff had spread faster than anyone could contain it. Harlem didn't whisper about gunfights. It shouted, and every corner, diner, and stoop was alive with speculation. The black Buick that had brought Bumpy Johnson and the Cadillac that carried Anthony Caruso away were long gone. But the aftermath lingered. The street where it all happened still smelled of smoke and wet asphalt, the pavement darkened by Stack's blood. Every hustler, every small-time operator felt the shift immediately. Orders were questioned. Payments were withheld. Routes avoided. Men who had thought themselves untouchable suddenly moved like ghosts. Stack's surviving men scurried back to Caruso, but the boss was already gone. Anthony had vanished into the shadows, humiliated but still alive, his ego bruised in a way that would drive him for weeks to come. Calvin Porter, meanwhile, walked down the block with a careful eye. People passed him, unaware he had been at the center of the chaos. Yet every glance at him felt like judgment. He had survived. He had his wife's life. But the street had seen, and seeing was never kind. The remaining gunmen scattered, seeking their own safety. Their loyalty had fractured, leaving them vulnerable to every petty feud, every rival crew in Harlem. One of them would likely disappear within the month, an accident or ambush labeled as street justice. No one would ask questions. And Bumpy Johnson? By mid-morning, he was back in the shadows of his usual haunts, unmoved, unflinching, untouched. Yet his victory was not the kind that brought peace. Every gunman who had seen him that night remembered his calm, his calculation, his control. Fear and respect were indistinguishable, and both made people hesitate. The ripple effect was immediate. Caruso's operations were disrupted, shipments missed, money delayed. Even Anthony's personal vendetta had to pause. No one could touch Bumpy directly, not yet, and the knowledge of it created a tense grid across Harlem. Calvin Porter returned home, still clutching the envelope. Lena was stable, recovering under a surgeon's care, but Calvin couldn't relax. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Stack's panic, Anthony's smirk, the muzzle flash, the smoke. He had survived physically, yes, but he was haunted now. Harlem, too, had survived. But like Calvin, it was changed. The streets had learned something vital that night. Alliances could collapse instantly. Betrayal could hide in plain sight, and the man who seemed surrounded might already be untouchable. Rumors began to swirl. Who had really orchestrated the hit? Who had leaked information? Who would rise or fall next? The block itself seemed to pulse with tension. Even the city above, the elevated tracks, the faint glow of street lamps, felt aware. People crossed to the other side. Windows were shuttered, and whispers floated on the morning breeze. And while Bumpy Johnson remained a phantom of control, the aftershock of his actions continued to unfold. Harlem had survived, but at a cost no one could yet measure. The question now wasn't whether Bumpy had won. It was who would pay for this night, and how long before the city demanded balance. Weeks later, Calvin Porter sat alone in his apartment, the envelope still tucked into the side pocket of his coat. Lena's recovery had been smooth, but the quiet wasn't relief. It was a countdown. Every knock at the door, every shadow on the wall reminded him that survival had a price. Bumpy Johnson had vanished from the block, as he always did, leaving no celebration, no victory lap. The street whispered about him, but whispers were all they were. Yet the image of him standing calm, surrounded by 6 guns and a storm of betrayal, haunted everyone who had seen it. Anthony Caruso returned, but he was slower, more careful. His revenge, once imminent, now felt impossible. Stack's surviving men were scattered, some hiding, some plotting. No one wanted another misstep like that night. The balance had shifted, temporarily. Calvin realized something chilling. The envelope, the surgery, the life saved, it hadn't bought him freedom. It had only bought time. Time to live, time to regret, time to remember every twitch of a gun hand, every twitch of a heartbeat under the pressure of inevitability. And that was the real irony. The man who survived untouched, the man who had paid attention, stayed calm and waited, wasn't Bumpy Johnson. It was Calvin Porter. But he didn't feel like a survivor. He felt like a debtor to every choice he hadn't made, every gun he hadn't fired, every life that had been traded for his. Outside, Harlem carried on. The elevated trains rumbled overhead. Laundry hung between tenements. Life went forward as though the streets had not been soaked in fear and blood just weeks before. But for those who had been on that block, life would never be the same. And somewhere, in a dark corner, Bumpy Johnson smiled quietly to himself. Not because he had won, not because he was feared, but because he had reminded everyone of a truth no one could argue with. Calmness and chaos could bend the outcome of a night, but the cost of survival lingered far longer than the gunfire. The lasting image, Calvin Porter, sitting in his apartment, hands shaking, eyes on the envelope, hearing Lena's soft breathing from the next room, knowing he had survived, but at a debt that could never be paid. Bumpy had walked away, but the shadows of that night walked with Calvin forever. And that is the story of the night Bumpy Johnson was surrounded by gunmen and didn't move.